Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Hartsuiker from IAB Europe. I hope you can see my presentation. Today, we're having a bit of a lighter agenda, as unfortunately, one of our CMP demos canceled, but we still have David Dabbs here from Conversant, who's going to show off their consent management provider. As with the last 2 weeks, I will start off today by going through some of the basics of how CMPs integrate into our transparency and consent framework. I'm also going to address some of the questions we missed out on last week because we ran out of time. And then I'll hand over to David, who will give his presentation or demonstration, after which you'll have the opportunity to ask us questions by typing them in the questions pane on the right. I would ask you to try and keep your questions until after we're both done presenting so that we can respond to them in a timely manner. And please make sure to specifically address questions about the CMP to David so that we know what the context of the question is. So just to start off about CMPs in the transparency consent framework, we just want to reiterate that this is one of the few parts of our framework that is decentralized. So we have central governance surrounding the framework policies. The technical standard framework is handled by the IAB Tech Lab, and the global vendor list is managed by IAB Europe. But in terms of the user interface that the people see who are supposed to give consent to the processing of their data, to give consent to access their devices, this is something that we have decentralized. We have some basic rules, which I'll go into, about how you're allowed to ask people for consent or obtain a legal basis for processing. And that's basically where CMPs come in. So CMPs are not strictly a part of the framework, but the framework creates the role for CMPs and the opportunity. But it in itself doesn't deliver the functionality of a CMP. So it's not the framework is not something you install and it handles consent for you, but it is something that is enabled by the framework. So there are some key requirements, as I mentioned, that pertain. So there's an auditability requirement, and there's a need to be able to rely on the signal of each CMP being the same within the framework, which is why they have to be registered, get an ID within the framework, and they have to make commitments to adhere to the policies that we provide them. Each CMP gets an assigned subdomain, which will enable them to read and write global consent third-party cookies. And we provide some tools together with IAB Tech Lab to support those CMPs. And lastly, a publisher can also be a CMP of themselves, for themselves, if they have the capabilities to build their own consent management provider tool. So the way a CMP interfaces with our global vendor list is that they connect to this centralized list of vendors. Via a CMP, a publisher is able to use the vendor list as a basis for disclosures. So they can give the user, upon asking consent, the identity of data controllers. They can explain the legal bases that are potentially being used by the specific vendor. And they can also use it to refer to the processing purposes for which a specific vendor needs access to that person's data. This global vendor list is versioned so that we have an audit trail, and both vendors and publishers have to also adhere to baseline principles and minimum standards. So if you look at the tables on the right, you see on the top table the legal bases on the right. So LI stands for legitimate interest, consent means consent, obviously. This kind of granularity and clarity is there, transparency is there to allow publishers to make their decisions about who to work with and who not to work with. And then we have a list of purposes per ID as well. So the registration requirements for CMPs, you can find these on the registration portal. There's a link to that later. But essentially, it's nothing that you wouldn't expect. Legal name, subdomain, prefix, administrative details such as contact information, a website. It has to be declared whether the CMP is to be used for the company's own purposes or if it is a service that they are going to offer to others. The CMPs will have to agree to the framework's terms and conditions, comply with applicable law, comply with framework policies, and they have to attest to the existence of company privacy and data protection compliance programs that cover both the GDPR and the e-privacy directive. It's very important to remember that the directive is law that is already in force and is one of the reasons why consent is relevant for our ecosystem. Because regardless of what you process data for and whether or not it is personal or not, the very act of placing cookies, for example, on somebody's browser or reading a mobile ad ID requires consent under the e-privacy directive. And then there's a nominal administrative fee, which is quite a low fee, but it's just to be able to have the administration up and running. So the process is quite simple. CMP completes their application form at this link. The validity of the application is then verified by an administrator. They will be notified of the approval, and they're invited to make a payment of an administrative fee. So as I said, it's quite low, 350 euros. Once the payment is received, they get awarded their ID and subdomain if that's relevant. And we have a list of registered CMPs on our website, which we update daily currently in the first 4 weeks of the program operation. And that you can find on advertisingconsent.eu. That's our microsite where you can find every bit of information that's publicly available about our framework. So I mentioned that CMPs have to follow certain policies. First thing is quite straightforward. They have to support the entire TCF specification. And very important for us is that they have to provide a consent revocation service and a revocation mechanism. This is a legal requirement under the GDPR that consent must be as easily revocable as it is to be given, to ensure that consent is, fair and it's not something that a user has to give and then has to struggle to withdraw. They have to also disclose the legal bases as declared by their vendors and update that information wherever it is stored without any extension, modification, or supplementation. So as soon as they get the information from their vendor, they pass it on as it is. They should not read, write, or communicate any of the vendor's legal bases except according to how it is done in the specification using the standard API. We've set a policy that CMPs have to use 13 months as a maximum lifetime of user consent with regard to any vendor and purpose, and they have to resolve conflicts in the DAISY bit before transmitting the information down the stream. So this is to reconcile situations where there's service-specific and web-wide transparency and consent being given. And lastly, CMPs that are part of the framework must only use registered vendors of the global vendor list that is also part of the framework. Some more policies that are important: they cannot exclude, discriminate against, or give any preferential treatment to a vendor unless that is on the explicit instructions from their publisher or other providers of online services. So this goes back to us trying to give as much flexibility and freedom to the publishers to determine who they work with and who they choose not to work with. They have an obligation to maintain records of consent and disclosure, and they have to provide access to the administrator with those records if they're requested. They can still be suspended or expelled if they fail to comply with any of the framework's policies. There's an obligation to flag as well to the administrator if a CMP sees that one of its vendors that it works with is not in compliance with the spec, the policies, or any applicable law. Publishers have to commit to only work with CMPs that comply fully with the policies and specification if they wish to work within the framework. And they also have the ability to operate their own private CMPs, but those would still be subject to the policies if they want to make use of the vendor list. In terms of publisher obligations, publishers can determine when the framework UI is shown. They will typically need to use a CMP, if it's their own or a third-party one, to even be able to get through the process of getting consent or legal basis. The baseline requirements for language design and other elements of the UI might still be developed, but they're not prescribed currently. So there's still some freedom in terms of user experience and how that is presented. The list of vendors that is generated from the global vendor list has to display at least minimum information for each vendor, so that it usually involves the name and purposes of processing. If a UI, a consent UI, includes non-global vendor list vendors, then there has to be a clear distinction between those vendors and those that are registered to the global vendor list, so as not to confuse any ecosystem, so as not to confuse our ecosystem, essentially. The UI cannot mislead as to a vendor's chosen legal basis. So if they say they do ad personalization, it cannot be presented as content personalization. That has to be made clear. The UI can be used for transparency and consent for the publisher's own data processing that might not leave their server, so to speak. So any first-party processing could still be contained in there. And users have to have clear and prominent instructions for revoking their consent or objecting to processing as applicable by law. So that's again what I said. You have to be, as a user, able to say no in some way or know how to say no. So we have some links here that I won't really go into, but they explain a lot of the information in a more technical sense. I will be sending these slides next Monday in a follow-up email, so you can follow the links there. But this pretty much says everything you need to know. The roster of CMPs currently is available on advertisingconsent.eu and not on the IAB Europe website. That's just a small mistake. And lastly, as should be obvious, the consent management provider sign-up is currently live on this link. So if you're a CMP looking to get in the framework, you can sign up here. So what I'm going to do now is address some of the questions that we missed last time because we ran out of time basically last week. So one of the questions we saw, which is actually not related to the transparency and consent framework as such, was the first one. We understand that IAB Europe is working on a position paper regarding the roles of parties involved in the ad tech industry and whether they are data controllers or processors. Is there any ETA on this? So this is a working document that we've been developing in the scope of our GDPR implementation group. The purpose of that group is to kind of provide thought leadership and make guidance papers to explain how certain aspects of the GDPR impact our industry specifically. That work track is nearing its end. We're in the final feedback stages. So we've circulated it to our wider working group and are seeking feedback on the paper, but essentially it's a paper which looks at certain criteria about how ad tech companies work and asks certain questions. And if the answer to those questions happens to be yes, then there's a very high likelihood that you will be considered a controller under the GDPR. I don't want to go into too much detail about that because it's a separate topic and it's quite a legally heavy one. So if you have questions about that, you can reach out to me separately, but I would like to not address those during this webinar. Another question we got last week was, what do you think will be the adoption of a CMP across publishers? So as I mentioned just now, publishers will have to make their own choice about whether they want to use a third-party CMP or if they want to develop their own CMP. But in our kind of view, CMPs are very important and somewhat necessary to be able to provide transparency, to establish legal bases, and to be able to communicate user consent choices to the vendors that work with the publisher. Another question that came in was, who is responsible for who is responsible for transferring consent data to vendors, such as tracking vendors being requested by the content of an ad on the client side? So the example they gave was if a first-party ad server delivers an ad to a user or a browser, that all being in compliance with consent. But once that ad is there, there are pixels on that ad which are send calls to tracking vendors, which is made from the browser once the ad is rendered in the browser. So essentially, third parties are getting information that an ad has shown up somewhere without the first party being aware of that. So essentially what's happening here in our view is that there's another vendor potentially in or outside of our framework that is trying to access information about a user's device. So for that just to happen because of the e-privacy directive, you still need consent for accessing somebody's information on their device. So it would depend on the one hand on publishers to be able to get consent for those vendors in the first place. But in this use case, these kind of pixel calls should not be happening by those third parties, by those vendors, if they have not been disclosed beforehand and they haven't obtained the necessary consent. So lastly, a question which we wanted to address especially because we had a news cycle about this week, is about mobile platforms. Are there methodologies for garnering and communicating consent on mobile platforms that are still forthcoming from the IAB? If so, when might that be released? So we actually released this week the mobile in-app specifications to support the framework. Those are out for public consultation until June the 1st. And the link below is a GitHub repository of the IAB Tech Lab, which has all the current specs, as well as there are currently two out for public consultation. The other one is the publisher vendors.json file. If you follow that link, you will be taken to that repository and you can take a look at those specs and even provide feedback if need be, if there's something you spot that should be improved or doesn't work. So that's something that I would recommend if you're really into the weeds on this. But essentially, we've just published the mobile in-app specifications, and you can provide your feedback at that link. And for that, with that, I'll stop talking for my part. If you're confused about the overall framework or there's things that you're missing, I'd highly encourage you to go to advertisingconsent.eu. There's also a sign up there to be on the mailing list. We cannot simply add you guys as webinar attendees to our mailing list because we don't have your consent to do that, obviously. So if you want more news, more information, you can find that on this microsite. And I would encourage you to do that if anything I talked about was unclear in terms of the overall working of the framework. With that, I would like to hand over to David. I'm going to make you a presenter now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. And can you see my screen? Because I don't have the...
Yeah, I can see your screen perfectly.
Great. Thank you, Chris, for the opportunity to present Conversant and our CJ affiliate division's consent manager. We've been working with the IAB Transparency and Consent Framework for quite a while before it was even called the Transparency and Consent Framework. And we're excited about the work that we've done on the policy side, on the technical side, and excited to be able to show this. So I think let's see if if my entire desktop is shared, I will pop over and pull up this fictitious e-commerce site. And there is our initial CMP, consent manager, a dialogue, the initial panel of it. one of the first things I'd like to point out is that except for my glitch with the network, it pops and occludes the site with about a 40% screen as soon as it loads up, so that the notice is prominent and the user's attention is focused on the consent notice. They're not precluded from using the site. We'll get to that. We'll get to that later. It's also customizable to the site's brand and look and feel. One of the things that we found in our discussions with publishers and with retailers and advertisers is that their connection with their audience and their customers is very important. And when something as prominent as this is going to come up in front of their content or their store, it's important that they maintain that connection to the users and emphasize that that's why we start out the paragraph with trust and transparency, right? You want to maintain that this is a relationship with your audience. And in addition to putting the brand's, the hosting site's logo on it, it's not in use here, but we have if the site so chooses, everything about the consent solicitation UI is styled with CSS. So they can provide the URL to CSS override, we call it, and if they want to, change the web font, the alignment, can't change the text because it's an important aspect of the lawfulness of the presentation, which I'll touch on some later. But the styling of the buttons, anything that really has to do with brand identity, that was a really important aspect also, as I said. So, depending on how deep you are in the weeds of GDPR and consent and all of that, you know that consent needs to be informed amongst a number of other adjectives. And so, I think we all, the hope and assumption is that people, because they're inured and used to cookie banner dialogues, will encounter these and see, oh, this website uses cookies and analytics technologies. That's fine, let me continue. But to be lawful, you do have to, we felt with the consultation with outside legal counsel who were intimately familiar with the way the DPAs are thinking, or at least initial interpretations of the regulation, that it needed to have a factual presentation to the user about the kinds of technologies, prospective processing that's going to be in use, with as much information, but we can't put everything in here. So for instance, you can see that for the hosting site, there's a link to their privacy policy, and if they do have one, a cookies policy, which I would imagine at this point, most EU-based sites have that, so that there's the opportunity, while not directly in the user interface here, we make it, as Chris mentioned before, it's one of the things that we have to make sure that the bases that we cover, that enough disclosure and information is available to the data subject so they know what's going on. But I wanted to click on this because we make available here, without going into the much more detailed screens, an opportunity for the user to see all of the parties or vendors who may be processing their data, or with whom the data may be shared. I'll touch on more of that later. Let's see. Of course, the languages, I shouldn't skip that. We currently, in this demo, only support English, but we will be providing a translation for all of the EEA languages. And the widget, as we like to call it, it gets a little awkward to continue to say consent manager. The widget, as we call it, will automatically detect the user's language setting, and if it's one that we support, then it will use that language. So I think I've covered everything there. The last thing, which we've, as Chris was saying, a frequently asked question is, what about mobile users? Because Europe is pretty much mobile first, And so we are responsive design. This, I don't have a setup to show it in, encased by a mobile device, but if this were in a mobile device, it increases the font size, and it adjusts the screen and the elements to fit a mobile device. So that's definitely covered and an important aspect of our CMP, of our consent manager widget. So I'll touch on the importance of the language. So let's just say that someone it doesn't go in and continue on to site, and they want to learn more. This is where we hit on some of those bullet points that Chris mentioned before about some of the things that a CMP has to do. Some of these were added recently in the transparency and consent framework. Additional processing purposes here to make it easier and more digestible, if you will, for the user. We're calling them data purposes or data uses, but they're still processing purposes as they're called legally. And all of the ones that are published by the IAB are listed here. But the initial view that you drop into here is all vendors, or all entities, all vendors, all data uses. So as you can see, everyone that's been configured on the site is listed here, and we're disclosing all of their data uses or data processing purposes. As required, we're providing a means right here along in the flow with the other vendors, the opportunity to say, I do not consent to any of these partners. And in fact, if you click that, close it, you'll see as you go down the list of, which is another hallmark that you have to provide the user the ability to view and not consent to particular data processing purposes. But you can see that we're very explicit. If the user has said, I do not want this process, it's very clear what they're doing, that they do not consent to that process, that data use, and that vendor. So I'll go back here and restore this. Now, the other thing is, if someone were to choose this nuclear, as I refer to it, the nuclear option, there are still going to be vendors or entities that are, and many in the industry are choosing to do their processing under what's known as legitimate interest, and that's the interest of the company that that isn't overridden by the fundamental data rights of the individual. We're providing a link because most of these are. It's not, that one's not working, but this goes to the EDAA's advertising opt-out. Most of the vendors that are going to be listed here are advertising related, and so providing that, I don't have a link there. Anyway, we provide that option. To get the granularity, a user can go into individual companies and open them up and see the particular data uses and whether or not they're legitimate interest or consent based. And that's what this panel is there for. And for every vendor, there's an opportunity, just like there is for the site, to go and see their privacy policy, where undoubtedly everyone in the ecosystem is going to be providing more information, for instance, about data subject access requests, etc. So it's an informed consent. And let's go ahead and oh, now one thing I did want to call out. I don't know if you noticed it or not, that in our CMP it is possible because, and Chris touched on this earlier, if you're reading or setting cookies, then you need to obtain ePrivacy Directive GDPR consent from the user to access their device in that way. And in all likelihood, you're also a data controller for other uses of data that you gather from their interactions on your site. So we make it possible, but not every site can be, is going to be, or can be an IAB vendor. So the site itself is always listed first and prominently. So if we go here, we go it's storage and access, right? The generic logo company, as we call it, is listed, as well as the site. You can configure vendors that are processors of yours, or also, but that are not, or have chosen not to be listed in the IAB, which we thought was very important because not everyone is hip to the IAB framework, although everyone in the ad tech industry should be. And then if the user goes ahead and continues to cite, we have this little sort of coda at the bottom to try. This is again to try that relationship about trust and connection with the site's users, thanking them for submitting their data choices, and they are given the opportunity to pull it back up, but also advice that they can visit the partners' websites, their own privacy policy, because their own privacy policy of the site will probably have information about data subject requests and other disclosures. I want to go back real quick and touch on this language. Something we hear often is, can we control this language? It's a lot, and the answer is no, for very specific and I think good reasons. When the regulation was hashed out, originally there was only one notion of consent, and that was explicit. You had to say, I agree to this, or I agree to this processing, and so forth. And they ended up with two modes: an unambiguous affirmative consent and the explicit, one for the kind of pseudonymous data and processing that most of us are doing, and the other one for much more sensitive data, criminal, health, minors. The language that's here is sort of fact-based. Here are the things that need to be done, and it makes it prominent and very clear that by continuing to use the site, that this proposed processing, that you would agree to that. And in fact, our call to action here is not I agree, it's continuing to cite. And if the user clicks off, that also suffices, because it's as called out actually in the regulation itself, that a prominent notice together with an affirmative action can suffice to obtain consent without the need for an opt-in box. So it's important. It's an important aspect to it. And in fact, I think it was recital 32 said, consent can be given through another statement or conduct which clearly indicates the subject's acceptance of the proposed processing. So it's a model that we believe is lawful and contributes to a higher rate of acceptance. And in fact, I wanted to show reference an article that I read yesterday, which it was in Digiday about Axel Springer, the large German publishing group, who published the results of their testing. And I thought it was interesting that the article excerpted part of their privacy notice. I don't know if this was translated from German or not, but it's even more sort of in the weeds, if you will. The website uses cookies, web beacons, JavaScript, and similar technologies. I agree that, trusted partners, and it's interesting that they use that's a similar terminology about partners, trusted partners, pseudonymous user profiles, the generated data can be shared, you can get detailed information on the right to withdraw consent, etc. It's very similar to the approach that we've taken, and in their studies, they are getting this sort of factual presentation about processing scored the best in the testing that they do, which is what we found as well. They're reporting somewhere on the order of high 40s to 50% consent. We've seen similar, if not higher, in some instances, which is really important, because if you're all about wanting to maximize the amount of consented interactions you have with your customers or your audience, that's really important. The article goes on, you can read it yourself, but it goes on to say that they tried a video-based message, messages that sort of weren't begging the users, but said, hey, this is really important for us to make money or for us to continue business. It didn't resonate with users. So in addition to, just to put a seal on it, in addition to this being probably lawful, it also is very effective. So I'll go back to my slides. Just to close out, we've got this. Our CMP has this unambiguous affirmative consent model, which we believe contributes to higher rates of consent. It pops for EU users as soon as they access the site and provides that prominent notice. You can customize it to your brand dialogue or with your users. We have a responsive design that covers desktop and mobile web, which is really important. And of course, we support what we term a hybrid approach, capturing consent not only for IAB EU listed and approved vendors, but also the site itself and local vendors. And thank you. I know I went a little longer than the 10 minutes I thought I would take. I also would like to call out, finally, if you're interested in talking with us more or asking more questions or having a one-on-one demo, you can visit the URL there, conversantmedia.eu/consent tool, and there's a sign-up form and more information there. And thank you.
Thanks a lot, David. That was a great presentation. I'll just change to my background slide. Hang on, wait, that's the wrong thing. There we go. So now we'll do some Q&A. So please feel free to write your questions in the questions pane that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. I see we have a few coming in already. So first of all, I think this is a question for you, David, actually, which is asked by Paolo Coccia, who asks, will it be possible to integrate the publisher's cookie and privacy policies into the UI in order to provide a unique point of access for the user in which they can decide what to do with cookies, even the website's own technical cookies?
I'm certain something like that is possible, but I think if you, it's not an affordance that we've designed in yet, perhaps in a later version, but that's the kind of thing that sounds like is appropriate for a hosting site that wants to be its own CMP, where you would really have a CMP on steroids that not just incorporates these other solicitations, but then folds in your own cookie UI, if I understand the question. So we don't support that. It's something, I suppose, it's technically possible, but it would be, it sounds like it might be something best, at least in the near term, tackled by doing your own thing, rolling your own, as they say.
Yeah, that's sort of what I thought as well. It's something that could be possible within the framework, but it's up to the CMP if that is possible or not. Next question comes in from Emanuela Camerini. She asks, I see that the layout of the consent tool is always a pop-up and needs the explicit consent of the user. Could it also work as a common cookie bar or banner, I suppose? Having as an MVP the full consent to all vendors with an explicit agreement or also simply interacting with the website. So from a policy perspective, what I would say to that is, as I said, there's freedom in determining, and sorry, freedom is maybe the wrong word. There's flexibility as to how the user experience is presented in terms of giving consent. And a banner could work in a situation where it is clear, you're able to have a clear kind of a clear action that is observable by the publisher that the user has given consent. In the past, or actually not really in the past, currently you have a lot of cookie banners which simply say if you continue to use the website, we assume that you're okay with it. There is also some guidance from some of the data protection authorities, currently at least, that could be an unambiguous action, an indication of consent. But from a framework perspective, we have to be very careful with how that's allowed, and that there's nothing going on in terms of dropping cookies or reading information from somebody's device before you have that affirmative action. Is there anything you would add to that, David?
No, it's definitely contingent on, or contingent, not the right word. It's definitely on all the vendors that might be, particularly if we're talking about accessing the device, that you're not to do that until you have some indication that you have the right to do so, the consent to do so. We're talking specifically about e-privacy and GDPR. Accessing the device is something that most people have said there's no way around. There's no way, for instance, to say, well, I can access the device on legitimate interest. That's an area where, regardless of what you think about legitimate interest, that doesn't seem to be an acceptable interpretation of the law, though there are, as we refer to them, e-privacy deniers. But I think they're very much on the exception.
Yep. Not really a question, but Ken Dreifach wanted to compliment you on your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Gonna move on to the next question from Markus Scheilechner. Sorry about the names. I'm trying to pronounce them well. Where and how do I, as a user, opt into the usage of a CMP and them collecting information about me in my browser when visiting a website that uses your CMP/widget? Do I have the right to still use the website but opt out of these CMP practices? So I'll try and take a stab at that in the first instance. The data processing that is done by CMPs themselves are served in the interest of complying with the law, which is also a legal basis under the GDPR. So needing to get consent to manage your consent choices would seem a bit of a kind of redundant thing to do, and I think that's sort of what you're asking. So if I understand your question correctly, if you're not okay with the CMP recording your consent choices, but you are okay with the website using your data, or you still want to use the website, that kind of works against each other.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I didn't touch on it in the presentation, but as a service to the hosting site, who has a legal obligation to be able to, should a visitor say, I want to know, prove to me that you had consent on this, we have to produce an audit trail on the site's behalf, and we do that under the auspice that you mentioned, Chris, which is in service of trying to make good on the user's wishes to record that they actually did provide that consent. So I think it's not really something one can just turn off. As you say, it's also conflicts with the other goals.
Yep. So question comes in from Xiaoying Wang. What if a user closes the UI instead of clicks continue to site? Does that mean user consent or not? Assuming it's talking about using your widget.
Yes. Closing, continuing, clicking off, in our widget constitutes acceptance of the use of advertising and analytics technologies, as it said.
Yeah, and I think it's one thing that I've found really cool about your widget is also that you have this pop-up at the bottom to say, okay, thanks for consenting. If you're not sure, you can try again. You can look again at the settings and the information. I think that's a great kind of way to make sure that the user has definitely, had multiple chances to change their mind.
Yeah, that was, I explained it as sort of a brand dialogue thing, but it also serves that purpose to be, we're trying to take as much as possible for us as well as for the hosting site, the high road. That's the sort of privacy and transparency by design. And so if we're going to have a UI that operates this way, we thought it was very important to provide an opportunity to say, oh, wait, I didn't quite understand that, or an opportunity to go back in. I don't have it set up in this demo, but I think we're advising every site, because after the fact, the user may want to review, revise their settings. And so that's also a demonstration of the capability of pulling the UI up manually at any time, and we advise hosting sites to put that somewhere prominently in their privacy policy. That's usually where that sort of disclosure is there. So yeah, we thought it was an important feature.
Yeah. Okay. This question comes in from Tom Gibson, who asks, under what mechanism is consent passed through to third-party vendors such as DCO, Dynamic Creative Services, so that they know to serve the ad? I should reiterate, so David and I, we have some knowledge, but we don't have super deep knowledge of the exact technical specifications. Is this something you would be able to answer, David?
I'll give a shot at it. So
Okay, great.
the thinking from the beginning with the framework is, if you're framework sanctioned consent managers have to implement a standard JavaScript API to pull out a specially formatted consent string, we call it, which is an encoding of the consent that was captured. And so the expectation is that in a context where advertising is used, that the core ad tech vendors on the site, let's just, and I may be getting over my skis here, but let's just say it's a header bidding scenario, that somebody like Prebid, and I believe this is already the case, Prebid has a module to obtain the transparency and consent string, because via AppNexus's role as a CMP, because they're both a vendor and a CMP, that they would obtain that string, and then everyone that's there in the header would pass that down to the ecosystem. And that's why you may have heard, Chris may have referred to it, or one of his slides called it the daisy bit, because it's a bit structure that's daisy chained around. It's passed from one entity in the chain to another. So I don't know if I don't think I answered the specifics about the mechanics, but at least the high level, there's an expectation that the CMP provides a means to get it, that the on-page contexts get it through that standard API, and they pass it down through the ecosystem, either through bidding and then through ad tags via macros and other things. How much of that has seeped in and has been implemented in the ecosystem? It's an evolving thing every day. But certainly the mechanics of through bidding has been defined months ago and is in place. So I don't know, I hope I answered your question.
Okay, sounded good to me. There's a question to you specifically from Bikram Shrestha. It's quite specific, so maybe I'm not sure if you want to answer this, but what is the delay/latency with your CMP from loading the CMP to the actual daisy bit being available for SSPs or first-party ad servers to pick the daisy bit? Is there any statistic data from trials and demos around this?
It's lightning fast. No, it's the fastest in the industry. No, I wish I could. I would love to be able to say that I can quote that. But in the case of ours, and again, I may be getting over my skis, I know that our bootstrapper, as we call it, because we support an earlier version and a later version, one of the first things it has to do is get the string. But as for the latency, I couldn't quote you numbers. It's going to be in milliseconds, I would imagine, because certainly after an initial load of a page where the user's browser has probably open persistent connections and negotiated SSL connections and all of that, it's probably going to be very fast. But we haven't gotten to the point we've been able to run that sort of optimizing and or tests to get that sort of detailed performance metrics. We're walking right now. That's a running step, but I'm certain that where there are issues like that arise, that the entire ecosystem is going to work with the framework folks, because they delegate a subdomain to us. So we'll be working closely to make sure that those latency doesn't creep in. That's the best answer I can give you, I'm afraid.
Okay, great. Just to also add, Tom Gibson replied and said that was a great answer, so he's very happy with that.
Okay, good.
Question from Douglas Campbell. If an organization is both a CMP and a vendor, are they permitted to transmit consent to themselves as a vendor without going through the JavaScript API, i.e. reading a cookie in consensus space and forwarding to processing in their own vendor-focused domain? So to me, it sounds like if you are getting consent for yourself on your own website, the issue that the transparency and consent framework is trying to solve isn't really present. The whole point of this is to be able to communicate consent throughout the ecosystem and down the ad delivery chain. Yeah, would you have anything to add to that, David?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the. I mean, it sounds like maybe you want to make a call to your own domain or something to set a cookie, or I mean, since that's kind of the best term that I can think of is sort of intramural. That's something that you're doing since if the scenario here is you are your own CMP. I don't. That certainly seems reasonable, but.
Yeah,
it seems reasonable, but I mean, it's one of those things
unless we're misunderstanding the question.
Yeah,
but
certainly it doesn't sound like you're disadvantaging anyone else, and I think that was the intent of some of the language that Chris went through before in terms of obligations. But
all right. This question from Soren Brabet. Back in March, Pagefair criticized the IAB consent framework and basically stated that it is not GDPR compliant for several reasons. What are our thoughts on that? I don't have their reasons on hand, but there was a few criticisms that were aimed at us by Pagefair, and I think another organization also did. And most of the complaints or criticisms that we read essentially stem from what we feel is a misunderstanding of what the framework's purpose is and what it's there for. One of the biggest criticisms was we are basically asking the publishers to be the front and center and bear all the responsibility. Our response to that is that it's not something that our framework is forcing them to do, but it's rather a matter of the law itself. Requiring this, the law itself being the one that requires the person who is interfacing with data subjects to get that consent on behalf of processors and controllers that work down the ecosystem. So essentially, it's not our framework that puts the obligations on the publishers, it's the GDPR itself. Publishers are the only ones really in the right position to contact the user, to provide them all the information they need and to give them the opportunity to accept that data processing or to say no to it, essentially. Unless you have anything to add, I'll go to the next question. Okay, I'll take that as nothing to add.
Yeah, I'm like Forrest Gump from the movie. I don't have anything to say about that.
All right, another question from Paula Coccia regarding the question about third-party tracking pixels. The publisher might not be aware of those pixels. How can we act preventing data being sent? So this is a good point, and it came up when we were discussing this question earlier today in the office. But I mean, essentially, it's something that if it's out of the control of the publisher, that's bad in itself, but it's not something that should be happening at all. And it is up to those vendors to know that. And if there's some way for a publisher to know or retroactively know, I think the authorities would hopefully have to be understanding about that, because if somebody is accessing user data on your domain and you have no control over that, that's a bad thing in itself. But it was a very complicated question and use case. Generally, the rule will be that if you're not sure that you have consent to follow some user on a certain website, if you're not sure that you have consent to do that or a legal basis to do that, then you shouldn't be doing it as a company.
Yeah, even if the call comes in, if you don't have evidence or some knowledge that you can do that with consent, then you just discard the request. You don't log their IP address. You don't log a cookie if one is presented to you. I know that's difficult to audit, but that's the approach that you have to take.
Yep. Next question from Florian Gisler. Does a CMP need to record a user's consent decision somewhere else than the cookie, for example, server-side or for audit purposes? First of all, I would say that currently the framework works off the basis of cookies, but this isn't always necessarily going to be the case, and we are trying to iterate different methods for that. But yeah, do you have anything to add specifically on this question, David?
Yeah, we have at least our offering has an option to a turnkey service that stores a record of what was captured from the user, language, time. It's similar to the things that are in the cookie, that are in the IAB consent string, I'll say. I don't want to say cookie,
Yeah.
even though it's stored in a cookie. It doesn't necessarily have to be stored in a cookie, and as we move towards solutions for mobile apps, it will be stored in local storage and potentially into a server side. But it tries to collect things like the language, the way they exited, the language that they were viewing, the version of the global vendor list, and the local sites config, things that when pulled together could be used to evidence, well, this user did provide consent and this is what they told us. It would be stored in the server side, but it's an option. Right. A lot of these things, I think a lot of these things aren't clear. I mean, if I remember correctly, Chris, the law itself just says when processing is based on consent, the controller will need to demonstrate that they have consent, but it then further says nothing really about what that means. So
that's correct.
And so we're following the guidelines that have been set out in the transparency and consent framework by the IAB, who looked at this and said, well, the law doesn't say anything, but we all need to have a guide, a North Star. We all need to do something and do it similarly. So that's what's in the consent string. I think it's the version, the CMP that wrote it, the time of day, the date and time, the purposes that were that the net of what they agreed to, not all the purposes that were presented. That would be obtained by having a record of the version of the global vendor list, which includes. Now you've got control, but anyway, I was going to show the global vendor list at some point, but it doesn't matter. It's in the weeds. But the point is that there's some key things, and every CMP should be doing that by virtue of writing the consent string. Some CMPs, like ours or others, may have an option to record more things than are necessarily captured in the IAB sanctioned consent string, and tying that to some site-specific user ID for that future potential of needing to say, well, yes, we can evidence that we had consent. I hope that answers your question.
I think that's a great answer, David. We are at the top of the hour. There's just one last question that I'll just answer straight away from Xiaoying Wang. When the user consents, the widget goes away on the next page load. Does that mean the user cannot revise their choice after that session? And the answer to that is, of course, they should be able to. I don't know how it is implemented specifically by different CMPs. I don't know. Yeah, but that's a requirement that users should still be able to revoke their consent easily at any point after they've given consent.
Yeah, that's required by the regulation. How you do it is up to you, but
Exactly.
you must be able to do it.
Yep. Okay, well, that's all we have time for today. We filled up the whole hour. Thanks everyone for your questions. They're very interesting questions. Thanks for joining. And as I said, I'll be in touch next week with a follow-up email, which will have the recording as well as the slides that I used. So you can click on all those links that are just on my screen. And hope you have a nice weekend and nice day or evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks for joining, and thanks again, David, for coming on.
Thank you, Chris.